Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session on looking after your people, the board's role in avoiding burnout and disputes of key personnel. I'd like to thank you for joining us. My name is Patrick Moriarty. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Community Directors, which is an enterprise of our community. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the lands of the traditional owners, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. A little bit about our community in Australia Council of the Arts working together. So we've worked together over the last 2 years, and the background to it is the Australia Council conducted some research a couple of years ago and found that many boards were having difficulties with a number of arts governance issues, and we're committed to support both funded and non-funded arts organisations to be aware and gain access to better knowledge of developing their governance practices. And as we've developed these sessions over the last 2 years, we've delivered a number of face-to-face sessions throughout the country. We've also held a number of webinars on various topics that relate to good governance, and I'd recommend that you have a look at the Australia Council website, where we've got a number of the webinars that are stored there for you. So maybe a little bit about today and the terminology that we'll use. Now, we might use board as to describe your governing body. So whether you call it a board, whether you call it a committee or a subcommittee, we're going to call it a board. We'll use board member in lieu of director, board member or committee member. We'll mention the role that both the CEO and artistic director may play in your arts organisation, and recognising that in some organisations you'll call a CEO a general manager or a coordinator, but what we're trying to highlight is that there is an artistic element and there is a management element. And in fact, in many cases, the CEO may also be the artistic director at the same time. We probably won't talk too much about elections or appointments today, but recognise that however your board members are structured, whether that's appointed or elected, that particularly in today's topic, that there's a real role for the board in trying to lead the organisation's culture, and regardless of whether it's an incorporated body, whether it's for-profit or whether it's not-for-profit. Now, I'd also sort of highlight that there's no one ideal type or style of board, and every board really needs to plan for its own development and succession. So let's firstly sort of look at how we might get involved today. So recognise that at any stage through today's session, you can ask a question, and I'll have that being able to be transmitted to me live. Now, whether we take that actually live or wait until the end of the session will really depend on where we're at with the webinar. But what we will say and what we're committed to is, regardless of the number of questions we get, ensuring that everyone gets access to a response to those questions. Now, to enable you to ask questions, you'll see on the right-hand side of the screen, a little control panel, and you'll notice as you go down probably about halfway towards 3/4 of that control panel, there's a little arrow with questions next to it. Now, if you click on that arrow, a little box will open up and enable you to be able to ask questions or write questions into that, and we'll receive them as soon as you hit that. So please don't wait till the end of today's session, which roughly will be about 40-45 minutes, to ask those questions. Feel free to ask them at any time. So, in effect, what are we going to cover today? Well, we're going to do a little bit about the board as the leader of the organisational culture. we're going to talk about engaging your team in that and in effect sharing responsibility. Want to talk about values and expectations, and we're going to maybe delve into a recent review that's been conducted to sort of highlight the importance of that. How to actually consider linking your performance review with those elements, and a little bit about how to then make sure that when we do that performance review, we don't end up getting ourselves into more bother. So a little bit about why all of this is important. Now, the size of the Australian not-for-profit sector is large, and the calls for rationalisation, collaboration and mergers are not unique to Australia. It's a worldwide phenomenon, and the arts are not immune from that. And what we tend to see is an argument for bigger being better. We're seeing increased change in government funding, shifts in focus, shifts in priority. There's an increased competition for all sorts of things, including funding, donations, volunteer support, our clients and our audiences. There's an increasingly suspicious and demanding donor cohort who are demanding greater transparency, accountability, and proof that their contribution is actually leading to something of worth and impact. We're seeing different funding and purchasing arrangements, changes in the audience consumption models, free worldwide online content and streaming. We're seeing casualisation of the workforce, we're seeing part-time focus, we're seeing tech-fueled adjustments and disruptions, and new drivers for younger cohort. Increasingly throughout Australia, we're seeing changes in the volunteer market, and in effect, we're starting to see an increased demand for skill-based volunteering and professional management of volunteers. And at the same time, we're tending to see people have less time available to support that volunteering. So the changes and challenges can often appear overwhelming, but by having good governance paired with good management, that can ensure that we've got an organisation that stays on top of it all, it survives and it thrives. Now, governance isn't just one model. So really, the model that we've developed with the Australia Council, in effect, encompasses three core elements. A leadership element that sets and stewards the future, a people element where we try and get the right people in the right role for the right reasons, and a practices element that ensures that we take actions to ensure due diligence. And these roles overlap. And as an example, when we talk about, and largely what we're going to focus on today, is the leadership element. If one piece is missing, it can cause the whole organisation to be incomplete. We don't necessarily focus without taking these elements into account. So when the board leadership element overlaps with the people element, the board leads the purpose of the organisation, and we're going to come to that a fair bit today, and is dependent on the chair to guide it. Together, they lead with vision by optimising risk and by fully engaging with the organisation's artistic vision. So the other element where leadership overlaps is with practices. And the leaders of the organisation, the board, together with management, are responsible for determining the risk appetite and optimising those risks, and managing the artistic health and vision for the organisation. I do that with diligent practices by ensuring structures and processes are established to ensure they make informed decisions, including the role of ensuring it's sustainable. And they are reflective in the work that they do. So looking at the definition before you, you can see that a very simple definition of what we consider as good governance is the way in which an organisation is steered and stewarded. So for many of you who've either attended the face-to-face sessions or listened to us on the other webinars, you probably now appreciate that the steering role is in effect the direction-setting role for arts organisations, ensuring that your organisations have a future and a plan to be artistically vibrant. But boards are servants of their communities, and many often forget that their role is to bring people along with them. And over the last 2 years of the program, we've heard many instances of the board being distant from their organisations, from their staff and their management. And really, that shouldn't be the case. It's important that all boards also have a knowledge of the operational element without straying into the interference of management, but instead gaining an appreciation that the course they set is actually realistic to be achieved. And they're open to changing the course if the winds actually change. So boards are also custodians of the organisation's culture. And we've seen recent examples from all sorts of fields where boards have allowed the culture to in effect be what we do around here. And we've seen this exhibited in many forms, such as harassment, bullying, corruption, burnout, and stress. And today we want to explore how the board can not only keep an eye on these issues, but ensure that everyone demonstrates good cultural leadership. Put simply, your board really is the leader of organisational culture. And recently we've seen an explosive review that picked over really a toxic culture linked to Australia's cricket's shameful ball tampering affair and laid bare the risks for leaders who think it can't happen to us. The subsequently brutally honest examination by one of our community's board members and the Ethics Centre Executive Director, Simon Longstaff, of that review called Australian Cricket, A Matter of Balance, found the ball tampering scandal was a symptom of the prevailing culture in Australian men's cricket, described as arrogant, bullying and dictatorial. And in effect, when recently Simon was asked who should shoulder the blame for the poor culture at any organisation, he says that leaders should really look to themselves. And in the end, it's always the leadership team, and often an individual, generally the chair, who must accept responsibilities. You have to go in with your eyes open and know that in the end, the quality of an organisational culture is the responsibility of those who lead. And I really think that's something that we shouldn't forget, that boards are actually leaders of the organisation. Now, obviously in concert with the management and the staff, but they cannot live in isolation and not test that the values and the culture that they should be leading are actually being put into practice. So how can the board actually lead the organisational culture? And really this is something that we've worked on fairly heavily over the last couple of years. We really should have for our organisation a clear statement of purpose. We should then ensure that everyone is able to articulate our artistic direction, our vision. That as an organisation, collaboratively, our culture. That these aren't some esoteric or nebulous elements that are hard to grasp or able to be driven through with a truck. What we want you to consider is, what do those values mean for our organisations, and what are the behavioural elements that we would expect to be demonstrated from that value? And even though these are now articulated, how does the board and management ensure that these are actually being demonstrated in practice? So when we talk about stress testing that, you've got various avenues for you to check in and feel the pulse of your organisation's culture. That can be done through surveys. It can be done through focus groups. You could sit down and undertake personal interviews. You could, in effect, review or audit your policies, your codes. You should ensure that compliance is not forgotten and that the right things are being followed. So the ethical framework that Simon has utilised for the Australia Cricket Review, in effect, looks at three elements: a purpose, a values, and a principles element. So in effect, the purpose is who we are in the world is directed by our sense of purpose, and it provides the why elements. Sitting within that are the values, and that's the way we see the world being shaped, and they are the what elements. And then where I've talked about the behavioural elements, in effect, Simon has articulated that as principles, and they are the way we act in the world, and they are a reflection of our principles. And in effect, they are the how elements. So one of the issues that we've seen as we've gone through the last couple of years is, in effect, the board feeling like GM, coordinator, artistic director, to meet. And that then means that that stress is passed down the line to staff, volunteers and supporters. And in some cases, and I think we can look at the banking industry as an issue of this, it lends itself to shortcuts being taken or risks being undertaken that shouldn't occur. And if the board is responsible for the setting of the direction, and that can't actually be achieved, inevitably it isn't who's at fault. And that tends to follow that the CEO is, in effect, the blame point for the board setting a direction that can never be fulfilled. And if that's not actually appreciated, then in most cases, it's the CEO who takes the bullet, not the board. And there has to be a bridge for the board to be able to cross between the strategic plan and the operational plan. If these are our objectives, what are the strategies that are going to be implemented? Who's going to lead them? When is that going to need to be achieved? And how much funding, how much resource will be allocated to each of those strategies? And inevitably, if we put all of that back together and try and package it back up the line, a lot of it won't be able to be achieved. Therefore, something has to give. And things can be deferred. We can seek additional fundraising. We can try to access more staff, more volunteers. And at this level, it has to be an iterative process to ensure that you actually set a realistic objective for your organisation. And the board must be engaged and have an understanding of that process. Not leading it, but making sure it's kept the pulse to ensure that the strategic element is not biting off more than you can chew. And the board has to utilise this as part of the performance review process. So what process of review should we be putting in place? The boards can put in place, as the manager, CEO is primarily responsible for management and the bridge between the board and staff, there should be a clear division of the management and board roles, regardless of whether this is the artistic director or the CEO. However, the board should be aware that managers need to be able to escalate matters with staff to the board if that's required. And also, it should be made clear in policies which issues go directly to the board or via a different mechanism. And that's the trigger for your grievance process or complaints process about your manager or artistic director. Board members should not also undermine or overstep the manager. It's best for the board members not to give direct instructions to staff, but to do so through the manager with proper protocols and approval processes in place. And the board needs to avoid conflicts between the board and the staff members. And it's good for the company to have a clear artistic vision which the board and staff members and volunteers can identify with, and particularly board members should be able to connect and articulate. Additionally, there should be clear policies which outline the role of the board and the structure of the organisation and the communication methods that occur within it. And staff should not be kept separate of this. They need to be able to implement board decisions, so it's important that the board is able, with management, to consult with them where possible, especially on strategic directions. And that's where working groups or subcommittees can be really useful for some board members to be involved with. And staff should also feel like that their ideas are heard, so directors should work with their management team to bring forward those ideas from employees to the board. And we should set up a culture of reviewing policies regularly to ensure they're up to date and adapted and meet the organisation's current situation. And probably one of the biggest gaps that we've seen is that annual performance reviews of staff by the management and performance reviews of the manager by the board should also occur. And we've seen that as an enormous gap. And the board should also allow any grievances or problems to be identified and addressed early on, rather than it getting to a stage where things get out of control. Now, the board and the manager share responsibility, and we recognise that some arts organisations have a blurred line of shared management with a CEO and an artistic director. In this case, it's even more critical that we get clarity around those dual roles. And in effect, for the board, we recognise that in some instances there's going to be shades of grey around who's actually responsible. And what we'd really encourage you to consider within that is we recognise that at some stages these shades of grey will occur. And when these shades of grey occur, how will we deal with that issue? And we'd recommend that's when it's escalated to the board for the board to clarify. And a harmonious relationship between the board and a manager is vital for the success of any organisation. And when we talk later on about performance review of your CEO, your artistic director, recognise that it's critical that the chair and your CEO, artistic director, not only have the formal performance reviews, but in effect there's regular checking in with the chair, not in a compliance context, but more of a relational context. How are things going? Is there any support you need? Questions that can just test the pulse of the organisation without undertaking a full review. And when we get to recognising the manager's performance, we really do need to start with a clear job description, and that will form the basis for a review so that the manager and board are both clear on what the management's objectives, responsibilities and goals were. It's best to also have some qualitative goals as well as those quantitative goals that can be measured and assessed. And the managers should be clear on what their obligations are and what their key performance indicators are. And they have got to be realistic and they've got to be linked to the plan. Additional documents could sit alongside that, such as a performance review process, and they should never come as a surprise. So your manager should be prepared so that they know it's coming up. It may even help the review and further discussion to ask them to reflect on their own performance. So we should be discussing with them what the process will be and be open to their input in terms of how they would like to receive information. And these should be a two-way process. It should not just be what the manager needs to improve. It should be also about the development of the board at the same time. How can we improve as a board? What should we stop doing? What should we start doing? And what should we keep doing? There are various methods of review, and we could survey a manager's performance, and that would be sent out to a variety of stakeholders such as staff, members, funders, partners, and the board members themselves. Questions could include how well the manager has led the organisation, guided its strategic goals, facilitated a good workplace culture, and been a positive advocate. That offers the advantage of the board getting feedback on aspects of the manager's role they might not be privy to, e.g. how they work around the place on a day-to-day basis, how they react and are involved and engaged in partnership meetings, how they build relationships with stakeholders. On the other hand, surveys may be more perception-based instead of focused on the objective data and how goals are achieved. The results should be taken with a grain of salt and ultimately not be the only basis on which we're reviewing the manager. Obviously, organisational performance, the board should decide how they're going to evaluate the manager based on how the organisation's performed as a whole. And again, that's the linking back to the strategic plan. How do we know that we're being successful as an organisation? And that might be in terms of the strategic goals having been achieved. And that could be as simple as, have we received more donations? Are our audience take-ups increased? Do we have a surplus at the end of the year? The board should look at the actions the manager's taken and how it's affected the outcomes. And that has the benefits in that it prevents the board from micromanaging the manager and letting the manager do things their own way, as long as the overarching objectives are reached. It's also a very objective approach rather than based on subjective perceptions. We can then look potentially at the strengths and weaknesses. So look at the job description, the annual report, and the strategic plan. The board could take into account and should take into account the job description and how it's linked to their actual performance. The board might then consider what the manager's strengths are and what their weaknesses are. And that's more of an informal approach, and it could involve having a discussion with the manager where the board acts more in a facilitative and constructive discussion on how management could be adjusted and best achieve the objectives of the organisation. And again, that could be a reflective process where the CEO also does their own review around their strengths and weaknesses. And that approach is most effective at creating an intimate and cohesive working relationship between the board and manager. However, it's also the most subjective approach and can be difficult to connect to the organisational performance. So none of these decisions are perfect, and usually a mix of a few of these review methods tailored to your organisation's need, its size and its structure, and the management and the board's role is probably best. So boards should be balanced in their review and not just be negative. They should be sympathetic that the manager has a lot of things to juggle and the goals need to be achieved may often be longer term. Having said that, it's important to face the problems and be clear on what needs to be improved. If the manager has not understood what the board expects, this needs to be clarified. And the board must be open in its communication. The review should focus on performance instead of a personal opinion. And personality should only be a factor in the overall performance. Boards should be flexible in their review, adjusting to different assessment approaches if one doesn't work particularly well. The board should also be aware that goals and measurement criteria may have changed throughout the year, particularly if they have diverted the manager to implement something that was unplanned. And that has to be considered in the performance review. Lastly, the board should be ready to evaluate themselves. Did it help or hinder the manager's performance? How can the board better support the manager? Remember, you actually chose the manager, and it's incumbent on you to ensure that you are getting the best performance out of them. If the manager or another employee is underperforming, the board should try and manage that before jumping straight into a dismissal. Obviously, performance management has to come first. You should counsel the manager or employee, set up a meeting to outline how they've underperformed, give them an opportunity to respond. Set up a personal development plan to help them improve their performance. Try to set some concrete actions in place so that you can very quickly assess if they're improving and set a reasonable period for them to improve that performance. The next step would be to issue a written warning. If the manager or the employee has failed to meet those goals set in the time frame that you've set, you may need to issue a written warning which sets out what's expected of them, how they haven't met the expectations, and reference previous discussions on the topic, and what are the consequences for continued failure. Relying on terms in their employer contract or job description is really helpful here. Finally, we provide a further written warning. If the performance still hasn't improved, you can provide a final warning, and that should clearly state the time after which the employee, the manager, will be subject to disciplinary action, including termination if that hasn't been improved. Now, we do want to give a little bit of a warning and a heads up here that if you are starting to approach the pathway of dismissal, it's best to get expert advice and not guess on this element. And that's because we've largely seen organisations ending up with a lot of trouble and concern and legal action around unfair dismissal. And our legal partners, Moores, have often cautioned that in most of the cases they've had to support relating to employment and dismissal, early contact with your HR/legal/IR specialists may actually lead to no action being taken. But in most cases where they've had to deal with an unfair dismissal claim, it's basically come to them too late. So if we go through that process that we've undertaken, and if the manager is still underperforming and not improving, you may have to move to terminate their employment. If it is your CEO, your manager, you'll need to have a serious discussion regarding the notice of leave required, not just legally, but in terms of a handover, and who have you planned to succeed that CEO? And how will you handle communicating that to your key stakeholders and the general public? If you do need to terminate an employee's employment, you should make sure that you're in the best position possible to defend against an unfair dismissal claim. And to do that, you should be able to demonstrate that there was a valid reason for the dismissal related to the employer's capacity or conduct, and it was a robust, documented performance management process that will help provide evidence of that. that your employee, your manager, was notified of that reason, preferably in writing, following the performance management discussions. And the employee was given an opportunity to respond to any reason related to their capacity or conduct, and you did not unreasonably refuse the employee's support person in any discussions relating to the dismissal, and that the underperforming CEO manager had been warned about the unsatisfactory performance and had preferably been given an opportunity to improve their performance being dismissed. It's worth noting that how an organisation deals with the ending of an employment relationship will also say a lot about the organisation to your wider workforce and community. And again, it links to that culture that we've talked about earlier. The departing employee obviously bears some responsibility for how the relationship ends, but so does your board. It will largely be up to the organisation to set the tone in how that process takes place. And that means the organisation has to bear the duty of endeavouring to create the most positive end to any employee relationship, despite the circumstances which have made the ending of the employment relationship necessary. Organisations will also need to consider how that's going to be communicated and what the reputational impact will be on the wider community. So I think that we've probably covered off those key elements, and I just wanted to note that there are a number of support materials that we have on the Institute of Community Directors website that will continue to support that relationship. I would encourage people to check the Australia Council website. This webinar has been recorded. All of the slides are available for you to look through at a later stage. The recording of this should be up on the Australia Council website in the near future, and we encourage you to recommend other organisations, if they haven't been able to attend today, to have a look at the webinar. And just on that note, thank you for your attendance, and now we don't seem to have any questions so far. So if anybody has got any questions, I'll hang around for a short time and see if anybody has any queries. It would appear not. Okay, so in that case, we might call it to a close, and thank you for your attendance today, and hope that this has been a worthwhile experience for you. Thank you.